Now that we have a good understanding of how narratives work, we talked about that there's a literary side and a narrative and a historical side to a historical narrative. And remember, I mentioned earlier that authors in biblical literature tend to either emphasize communicating through the narrative elements, characters, story, plot, or they tend to emphasize more through how they select the historical events and how they present them. Let's talk about how do you understand a historical narrative where the author communicates through plot and characters and conflict and those narrative elements. I'm talking about things like the Gospels. In fact, off the top of my head, I would think that all the Gospels, really, the authors are communicating more through the plot and the characters than they are about with their selectivity, even though they're really, in some sense, doing both. The story of Jonah is a great example of where the author is really communicating through those narrative elements. So anyway, those are the kinds of narratives that you're going to be doing this kind of an exercise on. And really what it comes down to, when we ask ourselves the question, how do we understand a historical narrative, is we're asking ourselves, how do we make sense of the characters, the narrator, the conflict, and resolution? So let's go ahead and jump into it. So let's start off. Let's say you're studying the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Mark, or Jonah. The first major element to look at are the characters within the story. Now, I've listed here some categories of types of characters. You've got your protagonist. Your protagonist is the good guy. He's the one doing the right thing or trying to do the right thing. In our world today, in modern narrative, American narrative, sometimes the protagonist can be the bad guy, and that's kind of an interesting thought. But in biblical narrative, I really can't think of a situation where the protagonist is the bad guy. But anyway, so the protagonist is the good guy trying to do the right thing. Then you've got the antagonist, and the antagonist is trying to stop the protagonist, and he's ultimately the bad guy. Then you have supporting characters. The way I define supporting characters, you can kind of just rename that or make it synonymous with major characters. And so they're characters that either play a very crucial role throughout the entire story, or they're reappearing over and over again. So, like in the Gospel of John, the supporting characters are people like the Pharisees, who are constantly showing up and arguing with Jesus. You've got the disciples, and those are really your supporting characters that kind of show up throughout the entire gospel, and are major characters. The antagonists would probably be, in the Gospel of John, for example, would probably be the leadership. So you've got your high priest and his people, the ones trying to kill Jesus. So you have those. Then you've got your minor characters. These are characters that show up once. Maybe their name's mentioned or not mentioned, but now they could be really interesting and alive and important, but they're not really consistently throughout the whole narrative. So for example, in the Gospel of John, you've got the crowds, and it's basically this major group of people that Jesus is interacting with. You can have people that Jesus heals or has conversations with. So they're important to the story, but they don't appear throughout. Those are minor characters. Anyway, so these are your different categories: good guy, bad guy, your major characters, and then your minor characters. One last thing that I don't have on the screen here is that sometimes in a story you can have not necessarily like a specific person who's a character, but a specific kind of person, or a specific kind of character. So in the Gospel of John, for example, you have people who show up and believe in Jesus. They come believing in Jesus, but when Jesus says something that's really challenging, they stop believing in him. And so it's a type of character that's reoccurring in the Gospel of John, and it's really interesting to see how those characters impact the development of the story of John. It's, so you got to pay attention to that. As you read the story, ask yourself: is this character representing a type of character that's reoccurring throughout, or is it just a minor character developing the storyline? So anyway, that's something I didn't throw on here. Now, there's a few questions you want to ask yourself about characters. Once you've identified the protagonist, first thing is you got to identify who the protagonist. In the Gospels, it's pretty easy. It's Jesus. In some other instances, like I think in Jonah, when I teach in a classroom setting, I'll have a good chunk of the class disagree on whether Jonah is the protagonist or the antagonist, and it's really interesting discussion there. But really try and identify who the protagonist is, and then really the important question to ask is, what exactly is the protagonist, or what the protagonists, plural, trying to accomplish? Now, and you have to be specific when you ask that question. So you can't just say Jesus is trying to save the world. That's not precise enough. There are 4 Gospels because in each of the Gospels, Jesus is doing different things. And that's really, really important to identify. So, for example, in the Gospel of John, Jesus is trying to prove that he is the Messiah to everyone. He is God, and he's trying to prove that to everybody he meets, and people are agreeing and disagreeing with him. Well, when you read Mark, Jesus is trying to keep his identity a secret. So, as opposed to John, where he's trying to convince everybody of something, in Mark, he's actually trying to keep it a secret, and he's not doing a very good job of it. So, you got to be real careful to not just assume that what the protagonist is doing, but really carefully identify exactly what the protagonist is trying to accomplish. The next thing is, you got your main or supporting characters. Ask yourself, how's the character portrayed? That's a really important question to ask. Like, for example, in the Gospels, in Mark, the apostles are a bunch of knuckleheads. They're constantly arguing with each other. In fact, Simon even yells at Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, and they're constantly trying to one up each other and try to become the most important in the kingdom of heaven by getting in the Gospel of Mark, for example. They're just really trying to fight against each other to raise to prominence. Well, in the Gospel of John, it's a totally different view. The disciples are portrayed as really believing in Jesus, being faithful. Peter confesses Christ, and there's just a lot of positive portrayal of the characters. You also want to ask yourself, like I mentioned earlier, do they represent an idea or a group of people? And just like I talked about a kind of character, that's what you want to ask yourself. Does this character represent an idea or a group of people? The last thing is, are the characters dynamic or constant? So, are the main characters, supporting our main characters, do they change? Are they constantly good or bad? Are they constantly faithful or unfaithful? Do they waver? And that's an important thing to ask yourself. One last thing I don't have on the screen here is that you need to ask yourself about the antagonist. I'm going to edit it right now on this video. How is the antagonist trying to stop the protagonist? That's an important aspect as far as later on we're going to ask about conflict. But ask yourself, what is the antagonist doing? And that's going to be an important question to ask ourselves as far as characters go. So anyway, when you read the story, you got to focus on characters, who they all are, and what are they doing. Are they consistent? Do they represent an idea or a group of people?